Now, before we add the logic for logging users in, I want to come back to the question how authentication actually works. Of course, you already learned and saw that you collect the user credentials and you send them to the backend where they then get stored. That's what happened in the last lecture. But now we want to do more than just storing those credentials. Instead, now with the logging in, the collected credentials should not be stored, but instead validated to make sure that we have a valid email password combination. And Firebase will do that for us, thankfully. But then what happens thereafter? Well, in the end, we might want to change what we display in the app. We might want to navigate to a different screen once the user is authenticated. But in addition to that, we also might want to be able to access certain protected resources on the backend, some data that should only be available to logged in users. For example, here in this chat app, the chat messages should only be accessible by logged in users. Anonymous users who are not logged in should not be able to see or create chat messages. Therefore, once we validated the user data, the backend also creates such an authentication token. It actually also does that when a new user is created, by the way. Now, this authentication token string is a rather cryptic and random looking string, and you'll see one soon. But in the end, it will be a string that's generated by the backend that validated the user, so that's handling the authentication in the end. And it's created using a certain algorithm that actually ensures that the string, despite looking random, isn't random. Instead, it is a string that can't be reproduced by anyone else but that backend because it uses some secret key which only the backend knows as part of that token generation process. But it's then that token that will be sent back to the frontend so that it can be stored there, and that can then be used by the frontend to attach it to future requests that are trying to access protected resources. And since those requests then have that token attached to them, and only the backend knows how it created that token, the backend is able to verify that token and either deny or grant access to those protected resources. So that's how the authentication flow generally works. Thankfully, that token creation on the backend and that validation of the token on the backend will be handled by Firebase, since you're not working on the backend, and the storage of the token on the device will also be handled by Firebase, since we're using that Firebase SDK here. If we were not using that, we would have to store it manually and manage its life cycle manually because it turns out that this token expires after a certain time period. With the Firebase SDK, we don't have to worry about anything like that, and instead, with that out of the way, we can now add the login logic to make sure that users can log in and that they then also get such a token, not just when they sign up, but also when they log in. And we'll then use that token later for sending requests to protected resources. So let's now add the authentication logic. For this here, in this first branch of this if check, we can again use _Firebase to use this Firebase SDK. And now we don't want to create a new user. Instead, we want to log a user in, and that can be done by using sign in with email and password. Here again, we pass the entered email and the entered password. And we learn that this also returns a future, and that it also may throw an exception if, for example, an invalid email was provided. Therefore, here, I'll again await this and add final user credentials here. I can use the same variable name as down there, since these are in different branches of the if statement in the end. And I'll wrap this with try catch here, though since I want to use try catch here and here, I can also instead just wrap this overall if statement with try catch so that I can also reuse this catch logic. So now the try catch block is outside of this if statement, or to put it in other words, the if statement is inside of this try block. And then we handle errors here, no matter if they're coming from the sign up or login process. And then here, when logging in, I also want to print my user credentials here to see whether the login process worked. And that's all we have to do to log users in. If we now save this and reload, I can go back here, enter my email address from before, and here I want to use the same one as I did before, so the valid email and the valid password. And now here, staying in login mode, we can click login, and I get no error, so that's looking good. And if I now open the debug console, somewhere in there, you should see such a user credential output again. Now you don't see that token in there. Again, we will see it later. We don't see it here, but we can see this output here, which proves, in combination with the fact that we did not get an error message, that the login flow also seems to work. And therefore, with all of that out of the way, we can now create users and log users in.